Winter blanketed London in a thick fog, and inside the Palace of Whitehall, the fire burned as if trying to keep a dying body alive. At the center of that silent court reigned a woman whose very presence seemed a paradox. A crowned virgin, a queen without a king, a mystery dressed in golden fear. Elizabeth I of England, the Virgin Queen, the symbol of purity and power, carried on her shoulders not only the weight of a crown, but also that of a secret that history had buried under centuries of reverence and lies. For over 400 years, chroniclers, courtiers, and enemies of the monarchy have debated the same question. Why did the most powerful queen of the 16th century decide to die alone? Out of conviction or impossibility? The myth says that Elizabeth swore to marry only her country, but the whispers that crept through the halls of her palace spoke of something much darker, something the doctors of her time and her personal confessors barely dared to insinuate. The candles illuminating her desk slowly burned the edges of the parchments where the letters she never sent and the promises she never kept were written. Every word was carefully calculated, as if even love had to pass through the filter of power. To foreign ambassadors, the Virgin Queen was a symbol of virtue and discipline, but to her closest servants, to those who dressed her, combed her hair, and watched her without being able to speak, she was a woman tormented by an inner struggle that no throne could hide. Behind her honey-colored eyes hid a past stained with blood, betrayal, and divine punishment. Her skin, pale and covered by the white powder of makeup, was not an aesthetic choice. It was a mask, a protection against the passage of time and against the rumors that were slowly devouring her. Because in the Tudor court, purity was a currency of power, and the slightest blemish could cost one's head. No one could imagine that the story of Elizabeth I began not with a coronation, but with an execution. From the moment her mother Anne Boleyn's head fell beneath the sword, the young girl understood that love in England was a form of condemnation. That lesson transformed into a personal religion, a doctrine of control and silence. "Thou shalt not love," she seemed to tell herself, "because to love is to die." The religious figures of the time revered her as the perfect example of Christian chastity. But behind that public sanctity hid a dilemma that the church could never absolve. Was her virginity a choice or an imposition of fate? Some ancient texts, discovered in dusty 19th century archives, speak of royal physicians who kept secret records about her health. Rumors mention deformities, traumas, and scars that the medicine of the time did not know how to name. At court, poets wrote about her purity as if it were a miracle. But in the hallways, another version was whispered, that Elizabeth never married because her body could not or should not belong to anyone. That secret, kept under oath, became the foundation of her power and her condemnation. Meanwhile, her official portrait, the immaculate skin, the fixed eyes, the absent smile, multiplied throughout the kingdom. Every painting was a political statement. The queen was untouchable, incorruptible, almost divine. But no one painted the weariness in her hands, nor the loneliness that seeped through the folds of her dress. 4 centuries later, historians still wonder whether Elizabeth was the victim or the executioner of her own myth. The truth is that her virginity was not just a personal choice, but a weapon in a war of faith, power, and fear. The woman who never loved publicly was perhaps the one who best understood the price of love in a world ruled by men and by gods thirsty for purity. The echoes of her oath still resonate in history. My body belongs to England. But the question no one could answer remains open, hovering over her tomb in Westminster. Was that vow an act of devotion or a confession of shame? Before becoming the Virgin Queen, Elizabeth was a child scarred by horror. She was born into a kingdom that already smelled of death and betrayal. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, had been the second wife of the feared Henry VIII, a man who changed faiths and women as easily as he changed enemies. When Elizabeth was barely 2 years old, she saw how love transformed into a crime. Her mother was accused of adultery, heresy, and incest, and executed at the Tower of London. The sound of the axe became the first melody of her memory. That May morning in 1536, Elizabeth's fate was sealed. From crown princess, she became the illegitimate daughter of sin, erased from the line of succession, confined to a life of suspicion and isolation. The servants avoided looking her in the eye. The court, like a sick body, rejected her without compassion. In a world where women were only valued for their blood and their wombs, Elizabeth was nothing more than a shadow of the past that her father wanted to forget. However, fear became her teacher. In the solitude of Hatfield House, she learned to read and write with an obsession bordering on madness. While other girls played with dolls, she dissected the words of Cicero and Machiavelli. She wanted to understand the mind of power because she sensed that only those who understood fear could rule it. The theologians who educated her said she was a prodigy, but no one suspected that in the silence of her nights, the young girl spoke with her mother's ghost. Religion, omnipresent in 16th century England, transformed into an invisible prison. Henry VIII had broken with Rome to create his own church, proclaiming himself the supreme head of the faith. That decision plunged the country into a spiritual war. Monasteries sacked, priests hanged, entire villages razed in the name of a divided God. Elizabeth grew up among the rubble of that holy battle. Her mind absorbed both the prayers and the screams. The constant change of stepmothers, 6 wives in total, left indelible marks. Each queen brought new rules, new dangers, new deaths. Some were sweet, others cold as stone. One, Catherine Howard, barely 5 years older than Elizabeth, was beheaded for the same sins attributed to Anne Boleyn. From then on, the young girl learned to hide her emotions behind a wall of absolute calm. Later chroniclers describe Elizabeth as cold and calculating, but that coldness was an armor, not a flaw. She had seen up close how love could be a political poison. By the age of 10, she already knew that kisses could cost crowns, and caresses could sign death sentences. The trauma, however, did not break her. It transformed her. While her half-brother Edward VI ascended to the throne, Elizabeth watched and learned. Every betrayal, every execution, every forbidden mass was a lesson. She learned the art of keeping quiet, of waiting, of surviving. Because in Tudor England, surviving was the highest form of power. Modern psychologists who have studied her biography suggest that Elizabeth suffered from what we would today call attachment disorder. Unable to trust, she needed to dominate to feel safe. Love for her was a direct threat to control. Thus the legend was born, a woman who preferred to reign alone rather than kneel for affection. In the portraits of her youth, her eyes shine with an unsettling mix of innocence and distrust. Behind that gaze hides the echo of fallen heads, of prayers uttered before dawn, of knives that slept beneath the pillows of the court. No one could imagine that this child, the fruit of a forbidden love and a public execution, would end up becoming the most feared woman in Europe. Thus, from her childhood, Elizabeth understood that power and purity were 2 sides of the same blood-soaked coin, and that, to survive, she had to learn to play with both without getting killed for it. When Elizabeth reached adolescence, fate led her to one of the darkest and most silenced chapters of her life. Her stay at Hampton Court Palace under the guardianship of her stepmother, Catherine Parr, and her new husband, Thomas Seymour. In the eyes of the kingdom, Seymour was an elegant, charming gentleman, brother to Queen Jane Seymour's late husband and uncle to the young King Edward VI. But beneath his smile hid a dangerous man, accustomed to confusing desire with power. In that house, Elizabeth was barely 14 years old. She was brilliant, curious, and beautiful in a way that made adults uncomfortable. Catherine Parr, Henry VIII's last wife, treated her with maternal affection, unaware that her new husband was beginning to look at the young girl with a forbidden interest. The testimonies of servants speak of innocent games that soon turned into humiliations. Seymour bursting into Elizabeth's room at dawn, laughing as she covered herself with the sheets, or jokingly cutting her dress with a dagger while Catherine watched, uncomfortable. The entire court whispered, but no one dared to report it. In Tudor England, a woman's body was the property of her surroundings, and even more so if she was a princess. Elizabeth, though young, understood the danger. In her diary, fragments of which survive among the Hatfield archives, one can read lines of contained tension. Power does not always wear a crown. Sometimes it wears leather boots. The situation became untenable when Catherine discovered that her husband was visiting Elizabeth in secret. In an outburst of fury and shame, she sent the girl away from court. But the damage was already done. That experience left a mark on Elizabeth that never healed. The certainty that male closeness brought humiliation with it. Years later, having become queen, she referred to herself as being of ice and iron. Modern psychologists would interpret that phrase as the cry of a victim who learned to turn fear into control. Elizabeth, the wounded child, had understood a brutal truth. Whoever does not master their body loses their power. Thomas Seymour's scandal soon came to light. Accused of conspiring against the young king, he was arrested and executed in 1549. When the executioner raised the axe, Elizabeth did not shed a tear. But in the silence of her chamber, the walls seemed to murmur his name. Never again, she must have whispered that night. Never again would she allow a man to decide her fate. From that moment on, her identity was forged on the edge of fear and determination. She became a master of dissimulation, a relentless observer. She learned to use distance as a shield and wit as a sword. Even her way of speaking, meticulous, almost theatrical, was a strategy. Every word gauged the temperature of danger. In the heart of Hampton Court, where the marble still bears the traces of that winter, Elizabeth left her childhood behind. Innocence died the very instant she understood that intimacy could be another form of slavery. The echo of Seymour's footsteps haunted her memory for years, like a ghost that never quite died. And perhaps it was there, between the red walls of that palace, that the Virgin Queen was born. Not out of spiritual purity, but out of rebellion. Elizabeth did not choose solitude as a sacrifice, but as an act of resistance. If men could rule with the sword, she would do so with absence. If they used desire as a weapon, she would use its denial as power. History would remember Elizabeth as the queen who never loved. But the walls of Hampton Court know another truth. That love for her was the first form of violence she learned to survive. When Elizabeth ascended to the throne in 1558, England was a divided country, wounded by religious wars and the ghosts of three brief reigns. The young queen, barely 25 years old, faced a nation that demanded two impossible things: stability and a husband. The pressure was immense. The advisors, the bishops, the foreign ambassadors, they all repeated the same thing: "Your Majesty must marry." But Elizabeth, with her firm and almost serene voice, would answer with a phrase that would go down in history: "I am already married to England." Those words were not just a clever response. They were an oath, a way of sealing her fate with blood. Because behind the apparent political decision hid a mix of fear, pride, and cunning. Elizabeth understood that marriage in that world of men was not a union, but a surrender. To marry meant yielding power, losing autonomy, handing her crown over to another. And after seeing how her mother was destroyed by love, how Catherine Howard lost her head over desire, how Jane Seymour died giving birth, Elizabeth knew that no woman survived the marriage of a king. The ambassadors of Spain, France, and Scotland tried to court her on behalf of their monarchs. With every proposal, Elizabeth played the same game. She smiled, promised, negotiated, but never decided. Her ability to prolong doubt became a diplomatic weapon. Each suitor was a piece on the board, each promise a way to maintain peace without committing to anyone. The court called her the great actress of Europe, but those closest to her knew that behind her serenity hid an almost mystical loneliness. The secret masses, the Catholic conspiracies, the threats of excommunication. Everything revolved around her body. The Vatican accused her of heresy. The reformers called her a savior. Her virginity, once a subject of mockery, became a national symbol. England needed an incorruptible queen, and she decided to transform into that myth. Thus, the Virgin Queen was born, not as a biological reality, but as a political artifice. But Elizabeth was not naive. She knew that this myth had a price. Solitude not only protected her, it also consumed her. On winter nights, while the ministers discussed the future of the kingdom, she wrote letters she never sent, reflecting on the nature of power and love. In one of them, which some historians consider authentic, she wrote, "Love weakens judgment, and passion clouds reason. I cannot afford either. In her reign, every decision was a dance between faith and politics. She maintained Protestantism as the official religion, but allowed a certain tolerance so as not to rekindle the fires of holy war. She knew the country did not need a king's wife, but a mother who reigned without giving birth. Thus she became an almost sacred figure, a symbolic body that represented the entire nation. Her skin, her voice, her image, no longer belonged to her. They belonged to the myth. Official paintings showed her in white garments, pearls, and an ageless face. Behind that purity was calculation. Every portrait was propaganda, every jewel a message. Pearls, a symbol of chastity, adorned her neck like armor. The white of her dresses was a canvas where power was painted without blemishes. No one was to imagine her mortal body, her fears, her flesh. Only the goddess, never the woman. But even goddesses bleed. In private documents, her doctors recorded episodes of fainting, intense pain, and periods of isolation. The queen, they said, would lock herself away for days without allowing anyone to see her. Was it physical illness or a spiritual burden? No one knew. Elizabeth made silence part of her strategy. While the world waited for an explanation, she offered them mystery. The men of her time ruled with swords. She did so with symbols. If they shed blood to demonstrate strength, Elizabeth offered purity to demonstrate authority. Her virginity was her shield, her castle, her religion, but also her condemnation, because to maintain the myth, she had to deny herself all human pleasures: love, touch, rest. Thus a paradox was born. The most powerful woman in Europe was also the loneliest. And while the people revered her as the incarnation of the nation, deep within the throne continued to beat a wound that never healed. For centuries, chroniclers described Elizabeth I as an unbreakable woman, a marble statue dressed in silk. But beneath that perfect image, something did not fit. Her obsessive refusal to marry, her physical isolation, the long periods when no one was allowed to see her, everything pointed to a secret that royal power could not allow to come to light. A secret that, according to some modern theories, might have been medical. Among the documents of the Tudor court, notes from royal physicians are preserved that speak of inner pains, female afflictions, and a strange refusal of medical examinations. The descriptions are vague, written in the cryptic language of an era that did not dare to name the impure. Some historians suggest that Elizabeth may have suffered from Mayer-Rokitansky-Kuster-Hauser syndrome, a congenital malformation that prevents the normal development of the uterus and vaginal canal. A condition unknown at the time, but enough to mark her with the stigma of the impossible, the inability to consummate a marriage or have children. If that hypothesis were true, her title of Virgin Queen would have been more than a choice, a biological necessity. The crown would have built the myth to protect the secret and prevent a political collapse. In the 16th century, a monarch without offspring was a tragedy, a queen unable to conceive, a heresy. Other researchers, however, speak of another type of wound, those left by skin diseases or bodily traumas. It is known that Elizabeth contracted smallpox at the age of 29 and survived, but with scars on her face. From then on, she became obsessed with covering herself in white powder and thick makeup made of lead and vinegar, a mixture that slowly poisoned her skin and blood. Beneath that porcelain mask, the eternal queen was decomposing alive. The private reports of her doctors describe episodes of fevers, inflammations, and crises of exhaustion. In her final years, her teeth blackened, her hair became brittle, and her skin took on a grayish tone. But the makeup remained mandatory. The image had to be kept impeccable, even if the body was crumbling. Behind her resilience was something deeper, the fear of being seen as weak. Elizabeth had learned that a sick woman lost power, that an imperfect body could be used as an argument against her authority. That is why, when pain forced her to stay in bed, she ordered that the ministers continue entering her room, that they see her reading documents, signing letters, giving orders. It was a form of dominance. She ruled even from fragility. Some modern biographers suggest that the queen suffered from anxiety attacks or melancholy, what today would be called depression. There was talk of entire sleepless nights, of conversations with her mother's portrait, of tears held back behind velvet curtains. No one at court could dare mention those shadows. The myth could not afford cracks, and yet her contemporaries noticed something strange in her behavior. The queen who refused to marry often spoke of marriage as if it were a cruel institution. She said that women, upon marrying, become slaves to their masters. In her speeches to Parliament, that idea was repeated over and over. Freedom was not a privilege, it was a battlefield. Perhaps the true secret was not an illness, but a scar on the soul. Elizabeth had seen how desire destroyed empires, how love reduced the most powerful women to mere victims of scandal. She decided then that her body would not be a field of conquest, but a fortress. The price was high, an isolation that slowly consumed her, like the wax of a candle burning out on its own. Even so, England prospered. The myth of the Virgin Queen worked. No one was to know that immortality had a physical price, that beneath the jewels, the silks, and the white powder, there was a sick woman fighting every day to stay alive in the eyes of her people. Among the men who surrounded Elizabeth, none provoked as much fascination, rumor, and danger as Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester. The son of an executed traitor, a ruined nobleman, and a charismatic courtier, Dudley was the reflection of everything the Queen could not afford: human, tangible, devastating love. From their youth, the two shared a connection that neither politics nor morality could erase. They were souls forged in the same fire of ambition and loss. When Elizabeth ascended to the throne, Dudley was appointed her Master of the Horse, a position that allowed him to accompany her in almost every moment of her private life. Their closeness was immediate and dangerous. Courtiers whispered that he entered her chambers at hours when no man should, and that upon seeing him, she smiled with a warmth she never showed anyone else. The gossip spread throughout Europe. Did the Virgin Queen have a lover? Foreign ambassadors alarmingly reported to their kings that the throne of England was bewitched by a man. The Spanish ambassador wrote in 1560, "Her Majesty does not live or breathe without looking at Lord Robert." The rumors turned into a threat when Dudley's wife, Amy Robsart, was found dead in her Oxfordshire home, at the foot of a staircase with a broken neck. The entire court trembled. Accident, suicide, or murder? No one knew for certain, but Amy's death forever doomed any possibility of marriage between Elizabeth and Dudley. Marrying him would have been an admission of guilt. Not doing so meant keeping the secret. The Queen chose silence, and in that silence, she built a wall between her heart and her duty. However, the relationship continued, disguised as friendship and state duty. Dudley remained at court for decades, and his eyes, always fixed on her, became a mirror of the forbidden. Veiled words were spoken in public, and private letters mixing politics and tenderness were exchanged. In one of them, Dudley called her, "My Queen of Hearts and Thorns." She replied, "My dear Robin, your shadow accompanies me even when the throne separates me from everyone." Historians agree that Elizabeth loved him, but in her own way, from a distance, from impossibility. In Dudley, she found what she had lost in her childhood: unwavering loyalty. But she also saw the reflection of her own ambition. Perhaps she loved him not as one loves a man, but as one adores a danger. On banquet nights, while musicians played and nobles laughed, the Queen's eyes sought his. It was an invisible love, made of silences, stolen glances, and letters hidden beneath the seals of state. A love that could not be touched, because doing so would mean destroying the kingdom she had sworn to protect. When Dudley was sent on military campaigns and his health began to deteriorate, Elizabeth refused to admit it. In 1588, as England prepared to face the Spanish Armada, he fell ill. The Queen, busy saving her country, did not visit him. A few days later, she received a letter from him, his last. "Even in sickness, my heart beats for you, my eternal majesty." He died shortly after. When the news reached the palace, Elizabeth locked herself in her chambers and forbade anyone to enter. For days, she neither ate nor spoke. When she finally emerged, she wore the same black dress with which she had bid farewell to her mother in her memory. In her personal documents, that letter was kept with the inscription, "His last letter from his hand and from my heart." It is said she kept it by her bed until the end of her days. Robert Dudley was perhaps the only man who knew the woman behind the myth, but even his love was devoured by the machinery of power. Elizabeth could not afford to mourn him openly, so she transformed her pain into majesty, her loss into immortality. From then on, whenever she spoke of love, her voice trembled almost imperceptibly, like a candle burning to the very end, unwilling to be extinguished. The people continued to revere her as the Virgin Queen, but those who knew her gaze knew the truth, that this virginity was not one of purity, but of mourning. Time, that enemy no throne can defeat, began to claim what belonged to it. Elizabeth, who for decades had dazzled with her wit and presence, began to feel how age was slowly crumbling her mask. The long, sleepless nights, the poison of the lead makeup, the weight of years of power were consuming her. In the final portraits of her reign, her face appears rigid, almost spectral. But even then, she ordered painters to erase any sign of old age. "Do not portray what the people must not see," she would say. The myth had to stay alive, even if the body withered. Every morning, servants took hours to dress her, layers of silk, lace, pearls, wigs, crowns. Beneath it all, her skin cracked and her breathing grew weaker. In the palace corridors, some whispered that the queen feared the passage of time so much that she forbade the mention of the word death in her presence. It was as if believing herself immortal was the monarch's final duty. As the years advanced, the faces around her changed. Old advisors died, allies aged, and young courtiers began to view her with a mixture of respect and pity. She noticed it. She knew that the youth of others was the mirror of her own decline. To maintain authority, she became more severe, more unpredictable. Chroniclers describe her as a woman who reigned with words and glances, capable of destroying a career with a single gesture. However, behind that harshness hid an unbearable vulnerability. The nights were longer, the silences heavier. She slept little and spoke with her memories. In the gardens of Richmond Palace, she was seen walking alone, with a lamp in her hand, murmuring names from the past. Her mother, her father, Robert Dudley. The ghosts she had managed to keep at bay for decades returned, one by one, to remind her of what she had sacrificed. In her later correspondence, there are phrases that sound like confessions. "I have lived among masks. The crown is nothing but a golden prison." In another letter written to her doctor, she lamented, "The mirror has become my enemy." That queen who once defied all of Europe now hid from her own reflection. The physical decline was accompanied by spiritual exhaustion. The court revered her publicly, but loneliness devoured her. Without a husband, without children, without true confidants, Elizabeth became a tragic, almost biblical figure. A woman who had given everything for power and in the end had only silence. In her final years, even the act of getting dressed became painful. Doctors noted that her hands trembled, that her legs could no longer support her, but she refused to stop ruling. In one of her last public appearances, covered in jewels and white powder, she addressed her army with a broken yet still majestic voice. "I have the weak body of a woman, but the heart and courage of a king." That phrase, spoken through tears and pride, summarized her entire existence. She knew the myth would survive, even if her body did not. That was her final victory, making the world remember the image, not the flesh. But on the coldest nights, when the palace fell silent and the candles were extinguished one by one, the queen would strip off her crown, touch her face in the mirror, and murmur something only the walls heard. "Who am I without this?" No one answered, because the woman had been devoured by the symbol, and the symbol knows no compassion. The winter of 1603 fell over England like a gray mantle. The air smelled of dampness and farewell. Elizabeth, now elderly and weakened, had lost her appetite, her sleep, and her will. She spent hours motionless, sitting on the floor by the fire, refusing to lie in bed, as if she knew that lying down would mean surrendering. Her servants were afraid to speak to her. Her gaze no longer belonged to the living. "I have seen too many dawns," she whispered one night. "I do not need another." The queen who had defied popes, kings, and tempests was now fighting against her own body. Doctors spoke of exhaustion, of a tired heart. But those who knew her saw something else. A woman who no longer wanted to bear the weight of the myth. In her mind, faces from the past visited her. Sometimes she spoke with them, with her mother, with Robert Dudley, with the boy who was her half-brother Edward. In those imaginary dialogues, she sought forgiveness, or perhaps rest. It is said that during her final days, she asked that there be no mirrors in the room. The reflection was no longer an ally, but a cruel reminder. The walls were covered with tapestries, but neither gold nor silk could hide the smell of death. The court awaited her last word, but Elizabeth remained silent for hours, staring at a fixed point. When she finally spoke, she did so with a broken voice. There is no throne for the soul, only ash and echo. She died on March 24, 1603, at the age of 69, after 44 years of reign. All of England plunged into mourning. No one remembered a time without her. The body was dressed in her most majestic clothes, white silk, endless pearls, a golden crown upon her forehead. But even in death, the myth demanded perfection. The order was clear: no wrinkles, no blemishes. The Virgin Queen was to rest without imperfections, like a wax saint. The funeral procession crossed London amidst fog and weeping. The sound of the drums resonated like a heart refusing to stop. The people kneeling threw petals and prayers. Some said that as the coffin passed, a cold wind swept through the streets, as if the Queen's spirit were bidding farewell to the world she had dominated for so long. She was buried in Westminster Abbey under a slab she shares with her half-sister, Mary de Fern, the very same who once wanted her dead. Above the tomb, an inscription chosen by her advisors summarizes her existence with cruel irony. Partners in the throne and in the grave, sisters in hope. But rest did not fully arrive. Over the years, legends began to multiply. Some claim that her ghost appeared in the palace corridors, dressed in white, holding a broken mirror. Others said her voice can still be heard on these stormy nights, murmuring her oath, "My body belongs to England." There are even those who swear that, on certain nights, the air in Westminster smells of vinegar and white powder. The myth of the Virgin Queen transformed into a political religion. Her purity became a national emblem, her face a coin, her name a symbol of glory. But behind the greatness, the curse persisted, that of having sacrificed the human to be immortal. Elizabeth had no children, but she birthed an era, the Elizabethan era, cradle of art, theater, and empire. And yet at the end of it all, she was left alone. Perhaps that was her revenge and her condemnation, to be remembered eternally for that which denied her. Not love, not motherhood, but absence. In the echo of the centuries, her figure rises as a warning. Whoever seeks absolute power must pay with the flesh. And so, between history and legend, between sanctity and lies, the Virgin Queen continues to reign, not on earth, but in the memory of men who never stopped fearing her, nor desiring her. Centuries passed, and with them, the myth of the Virgin Queen became an armor that no historian dared to break. Elizabeth was canonized by collective memory, the woman who saved England, the mother of the empire, the incarnation of national purity. But beneath the archives, the censored letters, in the forgotten diaries, a much more human and much more tragic truth waited patiently to be unearthed. In the 19th century, with the opening of the royal archives, scholars began to find documents that contradicted the sacred image of the monarch. Among them were medical letters, private reports, and confessors' notes that spoke of bodily anomalies and fears improper for a woman. The Victorians, horrified, resealed those texts under the argument that they did not benefit the honor of the nation. But the seed of doubt was already planted. The 20th century brought with it a new type of research, psychological. Historians began to read Elizabeth's life not as that of a saint, but as that of a survivor. Her virginity, once a symbol of virtue, came to be interpreted as a form of trauma. Human behavior specialists detected patterns of repression, phobia, and absolute control over her environment. The Virgin Queen, they said, was not a divine figure, but a woman who had transformed her pain into power. Modern medical studies added new theories. Examinations of portraits and forensic analyses of makeup pigments revealed dangerous levels of lead that could have caused hallucinations, infertility, and mental deterioration. Some suggest that in her final years, Elizabeth suffered episodes of paranoia and delirium caused by her own mirror. The poison that made her appear immortal was in reality what was slowly killing her. However, the most controversial theory came from the biological field. In the 2000s, a group of medical historians from the University of London examined 16th century gynecological records and concluded that the queen might have suffered from a malformation that prevented her from having sexual intercourse or conceiving. If that were true, her entire life would have been an effort to transform her biological impotence into symbolic power, turning a limitation into a banner. Defenders of the myth reacted with indignation. They said that reducing Elizabeth to a sick body was betraying her legacy, but others, more audacious, responded that precisely therein lay her greatness. In having been able to rule a world made by and for men, with a body that this very same world would have despised. The Virgin Queen would not have been an angel, but a woman who invented herself to survive. The documents that continue to appear reinforce this vision. Courtiers' diaries, diplomatic correspondence, and servants' notes describe an unpredictable, brilliant, yet profoundly lonely queen, capable of inspiring terror and devotion in the same sentence. Every gesture of hers was a mask, every silence, a strategy. Her virginity, more than a physical condition, was a political and spiritual creation, a defense mechanism against the violence of her time. Today, historians no longer ask if Elizabeth was truly a virgin, but what it meant for her to be one. In a century where the female body was the property of the state and the church, her refusal to marry was a form of rebellion. By proclaiming herself the wife of England, she stripped herself of the destiny that biology and faith imposed on her. It was not an act of chastity, but of independence. And so, the truth that history hid for 400 years is not scandalous, but profoundly human. Elizabeth of France was not a saint, nor a martyr, nor a goddess. She was a broken woman who refused to be destroyed. Her myth of purity was not born of pride, but of fear. And from that fear, she built one of the most powerful monarchies in history. Perhaps the true secret of the Virgin Queen was not her body, but her mind. An intelligence so cold and fierce that it transformed fragility into immortality. In the twilight of time, Elizabeth of Sorthor still stands. Her silhouette, draped in gold and silence, seems to observe us from the shadows of the past. More than a queen, she became an idea, the image of a woman who chose eternity over love, power over peace. Her story did not end with her death, because her legend was built to never die. The poets of the 17th century called her the Dawn of England, the Victorians the Mother of the Empire, the moderns the first feminist of power. But behind every title, the echo of the same question persists. What remains of the real woman? Where does Elizabeth Tudor end and the Virgin Queen begin? Perhaps nowhere. Perhaps they were always the same. A woman who, in order to rule, had to kill the wounded girl she once was. The passage of centuries has not erased the fascination with her. In every theatrical performance, in every film, her figure resurfaces with a new face. Sometimes cruel, sometimes brilliant, sometimes tragic. But they all share an inescapable truth: her loneliness. Loneliness was her secret kingdom, the only territory where no one else could rule. In Westminster, where she rests beneath the cold stone, visitors still leave white flowers. No one knows exactly why, but perhaps it is a way of asking for her forgiveness. Forgiveness for having turned her into a statue, for having forgotten that beneath the crown there was flesh, fear, and desire. Because history turned her into a symbol, but symbols do not cry. If one walks in silence through the corridors of Hampton Court Palace or Whitehall, one can still feel it, that faint whisper that pierces through the centuries. Some say it is the wind, others that it is her, reminding the living that power is never obtained without sacrifice. that every crown carries within it an invisible thorn. Her legacy, however, is undeniable. Elizabeth transformed England into a nation that looked toward the sea and conquered the world. She paved the way for Shakespeare, for Francis Drake, for the expansion of an empire. But her greatest conquest was another, that of her own destiny. She broke the rules of her time and invented a new way to reign, not as a wife or as a mother, but as an idea. Historians still debate whether her virginity was real, her illness certain, or her loneliness chosen. But what no one can deny is that centuries later, we continue to speak of her with a mixture of awe and fear. Perhaps because Elizabeth represents something we all recognize and few admit. The need to control everything, even oneself, even if the price is humanity. Deep down, the Virgin Queen was neither a saint nor a monster. She was a woman who understood before anyone else that love and power cannot inhabit the same body. She chose power, and that power turned her into a legend. But legends, like mirrors, return distorted reflections. The immortal face of the Queen, and behind it, the solitary shadow of the woman who never stopped searching for her reflection. In the eternal silence of her tomb, perhaps she still murmurs her most intimate truth. Love would have killed me. Power has left me alone. And yet, I am still alive in your memory,